with Western Europe, Eastern Europe, they, they, they had much longer period. But in Hungary, and I'll get to it as to why it actually happened. The period is 9 months from March 1944 till early 1945 till the Russians came in. And why did they? Hungary was their ally. Hungarian soldiers were fighting along with the Germans. And at Stalingrad, in the Battle of Stalingrad, the Hungarians lost 85% casualties. They had 85% casualties. So, I was already, you were told I was 7 years old when this whole period, during this whole period. And why did the Germans come in? Because the dictator of Hungary was, I'll tell you his name, but you don't have to remember, no test. His name was Horthy. And he called himself an admiral, even though Hungary just has the lakes. I don't know why he called himself admiral, but everybody called him that. So, what happened to Hungary after Stalingrad, they really started to worry. The tide turned around and the Russians started to advance. A lot of Hungarian, I don't know how many Germans were lost, but it doesn't matter. He didn't want the same thing to happen to Hungary as happened during the First World War, where they were chopped up. Hungary lost a lot of territory. That's why you told me that your grandparents were Romanian. But all Romanians in Pennsylvania, they consider themselves Hungarians no matter what. And Elie Wiesel, he was here to talk at the Patrick Gymnasium. And I remember I talked to him for a short time at lunch, and I said, "You're Hungarian," and he speaks Hungarian, So, but he calls himself Romanian. He's one of those people that do. I don't know what difference it makes. But anyway, what was the population of Hungary? The Jewish population of Hungary. Well, the numbers vary all over. I read the different accounts. Some person says 900,000. Another one says 750,000. Have you heard of Professor Hilberg, Raoul Hilberg? Okay, those who have heard, I wouldn't have talked in front of him, because he could tell you how many people died in every village in Europe or city. I would be afraid to talk in front of him, because that was a very serious thing too. But anyway, those are the numbers. And about 500, if you take 750,000 or 900,000, if you take the people who died, the Hungarians who died during the Holocaust, it was about 500,000 in such a short time. Now, the Germans sent Eichmann, who was the architect of the whole Holocaust, and they were so efficient by the time they got to Hungary that, they just followed a recipe that they followed in every other country to to gather the Jews and send them to the Auschwitz or whatever concentration camps that they were sent to. And can you still hear me? Okay, raise your hand if you don't. Okay, you can also ask questions anytime, but I will save time to ask. So I'll speak more about Wallenberg than me and my family. Why is that? Because when I go to schools, they always say, we would like to hear the personal story. And then I kind of skim over the Wallenberg point. So I'm going to, if you want to ask about what life was like and so on. Okay, now, as soon as the Germans came in, there were 3 or 4 set of laws that the Jews had to obey. One was, the first one was to wear a Magen David, a yellow star of a certain size, and they couldn't be, if they were caught outside on the street, during the hours the Jews weren't allowed out. They were only allowed out 2 hours a day, to go get some shopping. But that was the first part, the star that everybody had to wear on their outer garment. The second one, that was the ghetto. So the Jews had to give up living in other parts. They all had to move to one part of the city called the ghetto. You all know what a ghetto is. Okay, so there too, they were allowed out only 2 hours a day. So it wasn't like an encircled prison, but it was just part of the city. And then the third part was that once they were in the ghetto, then the Germans could come daily and collect Jews to put into cattle cars. They didn't travel second or third class. They were packed in cattle cars, and they had no choice. Okay, now let me tell you why I have been doing this now for 14 years. Talk about not just Wallenberg, but about the Holocaust. And why do I do it? I don't make any money. It's not because there's any big advantage for me, but I had a relative. She survived the Holocaust too, but she came to the United States, and she is my closest relative, absolute closest relative, that had a great impact on my life. And from my talk, you're going to see she became a speaker on behalf of Frau Wallenberg. You know, I have heard several people say the Holocaust has become like a big business or a big thing, where people like to talk about themselves or about their story. Well, look, my story isn't the best, and I don't compete with anybody, but when my cousin died from pancreatic cancer, I took over for her. Nobody told me to do that, but I have been doing it now for 14 years. So that's why I'm a public speaker, and it's a wonderful story. Now by the way, until my cousin, or even not just my cousin, when do these speakers, when did people become at ease, not at ease, but more forthcoming to talk about the Holocaust. Up until the 70s, maybe late 60s, uh, there was no memorial day like we have a memorial week of the Holocaust, you know, but people didn't talk about it. And my family, my children, didn't find out about it till they went to college. So it was in the 80s. I just never ever spoke to, I didn't live really. I lived through the Holocaust, but I didn't live with it. That's a different feeling. Now, what makes it so much easier for me to talk about that period is because I want to talk about rescue. I wasn't in the camps. I wasn't in Auschwitz or any. I was almost taken away, and I'll get to it. And luckily, I wasn't taken. I just was taken away from the ghetto for a short time, and I'll elaborate on that. But it was through Wallenberg that I was really saved, and that's going to be the main part of my speech. So, what was it like to live in Hungary just prior to the Holocaust? Well, it wasn't a great place. There are a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of anti-Jewish laws, and they couldn't go, and nobody could go to the I don't know about the gymnasium, but certainly not the university. Okay, so how did Jews become trained? Because there have been, where were they trained? Well, they went to Germany to study, to Czechoslovakia. I had a cousin, my cousin's husband studied architecture in Czechoslovakia. And they just went out from Hungary for that period of time to study, and then they came back. Now, why did they come back, since Hungary wasn't that great a place? Well, for several reasons. This Horthy guy who was anti-Semitic implemented laws, anti-Jewish laws, but nevertheless, he had dual purposes. Hungary was an agrarian country. It wasn't even electrified in the farms and in the small cities. So it wanted to become an industrial country. And the Jews were very helpful, when they came back. Some studied engineering, whatever they studied. So 5% of the Jewish population in Budapest was Jewish. And most of them were well-educated. What has become of them? Doctors, teachers, writers, newspaper people, and so on. So, Hungary, in a sense, gave an opportunity to the Jews to advance, both economically, but there were still a lot of restrictions and resentment against the Jews. So, okay, so I told you that they were being picked up from the ghetto and sent to the concentration camp. And it's documented, the first article that documented the Wallenberg story, and it was in the New York Times. I think it was late 1970s. Up until then, nobody even talks about him. And let's see. Um, so by, by 19, middle of 1944, it was well known. It was pretty much well known as to what's happening. The Hungarian Jews, 10,000 people were put into cattle cars, taken away, never to be seen again. You know, maybe they didn't know exactly that there are gas chambers or any of that, but you know, knowledge in those days was not well disseminated. Why? Because there was no Facebook, and there was no, you know, Twitter and all the things that you or this generation. I didn't mean to pick on you. You know, today, the minute something happens anywhere, it's known 5 minutes later, or maybe even sooner. It's on CNN, you know. But in Hungary, you weren't allowed to listen to shortwave radio, so you didn't really know. You weren't allowed. Officially, you weren't allowed. You had to listen to the propaganda of the government, and they were winning. I mean, they didn't say Stalingrad, the tide turned around, you know, none of that stuff. So we didn't really know. Because, you know, one of the things that people say, I don't know who the people are, but I do know that it has been around, that they ask, how come that we went along like sheep, you know, to be exterminated? But why is that? Because we didn't know. We really, compliance was the essence for the Germans. Compliance meaning they came to pick up these 5,000 or 10,000 people every day. Well, it was always for our benefit. Not that they told us that you are going to go to a spa or something ridiculous like that. But you know, we will get jobs and we will be taken away. The men actually were taken to labor camps. Young men, stronger men. They used to work on the railroad tracks and so on and so forth. You know, they were right away taken to the camps. But that's why, because information wasn't around, you know, and it took all that time from 1939 on to 1944 to kind of get that information. I don't know how detailed people knew about, but anyway, it was well known that Hungary is the last place where there is still time to save some Jews. You know, they weren't all taken away, especially in Budapest. We had a chance to, we were the last ones taken away. You know, the smaller cities like Elivizel and 400,000 other people from this Transylvania and the smaller areas, smaller population, less dense population. They were picked up right away. The police, the police knew everybody where they live, and well, they were in the ghetto anyway, in the smaller communities too. It was the same thing. But in Budapest, we had some breathing time. So there was a refugee board that was formed in the United States. And they were looking for somebody who would go to negotiate on behalf of the Jews, who are still alive. And they went to a neutral country, Sweden. I have to go look at the watch too, so no, I don't. Just because I don't want to talk to. So anyway, they went to Sweden to a neutral place and find somebody who would be well qualified to go to Hungary and negotiate on behalf of the Jews. So they went to the Wallenberg family. The Wallenbergs were like even today, very wealthy industrialists, bankers. They're very important in Sweden even today. You know, it's like for Henry Ford, or he isn't the one I should become. He just came to mind. So, anyway, they went and they found Raoul Wallenberg. And he was not a diplomat, he was an architect. He didn't want to work in his family's business. He wanted to do something else. And they said, would you go to Hungary? And they didn't get a recipe as to what he should do in order to succeed. But time certainly was the essence. Can you hear me while I sit?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'll try to speak louder so you just not see me. Okay, so they asked him what he would need in order to go to Budapest. So he had conditions that he asked for. First of all, I would like the king's approval to be a diplomat representing Sweden, you know, so he'll have some clout when it comes to Budapest, he'll have some clout as recognized as somebody important. So that's what he wanted. Be declared a diplomat, have unlimited money. Why would he need money? Because he comes from a rich family. He wanted to have money because he knew that he had to bribe the Hungarians or the Germans or whoever, you know, in order for him to get done. Time was of the essence. Every day that he was taking not to be there, 10,000 Jews were deported from Budapest. So it was very important that he do that. Okay, so he arrived in Budapest in August of 1944. And I told you that Horthy wanted to be neutral in the war. Did I go through that a little bit? He wanted to pull out from the war, from fighting the war, because he knew that was one thing that was amazing. The Germans or the Hungarians would have much better be happy to be conquered by the United States or the West or Britain. They didn't want to be captured by the Russians. Why not? Because they were horrible when they were fighting on the Russian soil. You know, they were terrible. So he wanted to save Hungary from being punished for the Second World War. So he wanted to become neutral. So that's why the Germans entered I'm kind of rehashing a little bit. That's why they entered, because he wanted to be neutral. And there was also a coup that threw him over, and they were the Arrow Cross, the most horrible people that you can think of, the most anti-Semitic, and they even outdid the Germans. So that's what he was facing, Raoul Wallenberg was facing, that he would have to deal with these terrible people. And when he arrived in Budapest, the first thing he did, he right away wanted to go talk to some official, like the foreign minister of Hungary, who was an Arrow Cross guy. And I'll tell you, Raoul, just like the Germans, I told you, Eichmann had a plan, on how there were three routes, wearing the star, the ghetto, and so on, and being sent to the concentration. Raoul Wallenberg used not the same tactics, but he had the same arguments all the time. And it was the following. For example, with the foreign minister, met him, and he goes into the foreign minister's office, and he says, okay, you still have some time to save Jews, the lives of Jews. And here is your opportunity to be a good guy. All right. So, and when the Russians come in, because that was no doubt in anybody's mind that Hungary will become invaded finally by the Russians. And Wallenberg said, if you are going to cooperate and help save some Jews, I will testify on your behalf, that you are not going to be strung up on a tree. Because that was what they did to the Arrow Cross when the Russians came in. They didn't have a trial or anything. You just had to tell this person is a collaborator with the Germans, and no trial, they just hung him from a tree. And so that was his argument. So you have an opportunity to save Jews. So what did Wallenberg suggest? That they should be, who should be saved? Those people who can demonstrate that they have relatives in Sweden. So they argued as to how many such people exist. And they said maybe 5,000. And the foreign minister tried to save his neck, so he said, okay, I'm going to help let you have something called a Schutzpass. A Schutzpass is like a passport that you could, who had that, could obtain one of these passports, could go to Sweden after the war. That was an argument. And there were other neutral countries that were trying to issue similar Schutzpasses, Who were they? Portugal was one of the neutral countries, Spain was a neutral country, and just recently I found out that the Vatican actually was a neutral country. And a very good friend of mine who passed away, that has nothing to do with the story, but he was saved by being in the Vatican, you know. But nobody had the massive intervention or trying to save Jews like Raoul Wallenberg. And the Swiss did the same thing. So they were the major ones who distributed these Schutzpasses.
How many people are we talking about?
Total of about, well, it was originally they agreed about 5,000, okay? Potentially to be having relatives in Sweden. But then once they got that permission, then Raoul Wallenberg started a printing press, just issuing more and more. So in total about 25,000 such between the Swiss and the Swedes. They didn't ask for permission, they just printed it, 20,000. And it was an official looking, very official looking document, you know, with the person's picture on it, a fancy royal stamp. Because why was it like that? Because it gave authority to Raoul Wallenberg, you know, to issue these fancy documents. The Germans, the Arrow Cross, they were very impressed with fancy documents and official documents. So Raoul Wallenberg now had an agreement to issue these documents. So now, what would Raoul Wallenberg do to save as many as he could? Couldn't put an ad into the newspaper, you know, say, hey, you know, I'm looking for Jews who have documents proving that they had Swedes relatives in Sweden. He couldn't do that. So what he had to do is to go to where Jews were at any time. So where were Jews that he could find a large number of Jews? Well, when they were picked up from the ghetto, I told you that they went in cattle cars. But later on, by October or so, all the trains were non-functioning. The railroad tracks were destroyed by the bombs of the Russians. So they couldn't take away Jews anymore any other way besides walk. They had to walk. How did they walked to the Austrian border from Budapest. So there were certain gathering places where large numbers of Jews were ready to be going on these, what we call death marches. And I'm going to speak about what that was like. So Raoul Wallenberg goes to one of these gathering places. It was called the brick factory. It's a non-functioning brick factory of that day, of that period. You know, just imagine that you have a place like the Essex Fair. That's kind of not a good analogy, but you know, it was a large gathering place. So one day, and my cousin and her mother was at a given time when Raoul Wallenberg came in to that brick factory, and they were ready to be taken on these death marches. And Raoul Wallenberg comes in during the middle of the night, and the way he approached the whole thing is he said to the guards, I am Raoul Wallenberg, the representative of the King of Sweden, and I have these passports to give out to Jews, and I'm authorized to take them back to Budapest. So the guards, they saw that they're dealing with a person who has authority, and he wasn't afraid to use that authority, but he made it up. He made it up that he had authority. He was liable to be shot by any one of these people, but they let him in, and it turns out at that moment he started addressing the gathered people, the people who were gathered there. And my cousin was one of them. And Raoul Wallenberg says, okay, anybody who has relatives in Sweden ought to come forward. They didn't know that there is an agreement with anybody, but you know, if you had imagination and recognize that you have a 15-second chance to invent that you have somebody like that. So my cousin took out a piece of paper, I don't know what it is, what it was, it doesn't matter, but she volunteered to go to him, and other people who had the same kind of imagination. Well, one looked at the first one that got up, you know, and said that they had relatives in Sweden. Then all of a sudden other people came, and Raoul Wallenberg just gave each one of these documents, and they were allowed to go out from this place, this brick factory, and get on a truck, multiple trucks. They were taken back to Budapest. So what did they do? What would he do with these people once they come there? Because the Jews could only be in the ghetto, or what did he do? Well, he bought 32 buildings. There were plenty of empty buildings from the 400,000 Jews that were taken away before even. Okay, and so he bought those, and he declared them an extension of the Swedish embassy. So if you could get could get to that place, then that's what became their new residence. And so it all had to happen very fast, and that's what he did. And he did it every day. And many times, I'll tell you what kinds of things that he did. He went down to the border, Austrian border. There were a lot of Jews there that were taken to the train and then taken to Auschwitz. But he got there and he saw an opening at a door that wasn't closed. He just handed them these passes. And wherever he went, you know, when he heard of a group being taken away or marching on the death marches, he went there and he gave out, and you know, he always used the argument that I'm Raoul Wallenberg and I have, you know, the same thing. And the Arrow Cross gave in. That's a miracle. It's an absolute miracle that here was a man that was every day liable to be shot, killed, and he was able to, just by that self-confidence, he didn't have weapons or armies, and so he was able to save these people. And now I'm going to talk about my family consisted of my father, my mother, and me. So we were just two. My father was taken away to the work detail, those labor camps. So it was only my mother and I that lived in the ghetto. And how did we get to to an apartment in the ghetto? We didn't have a rental agent. Somebody who would talk us into a good place. What you had to do was bribe somebody to give you a place, it was always by somebody was willing to do something for you. Get a two-bedroom apartment for a one-bedroom apartment, something like that. But so we were in this ghetto, and Arrow Cross come in, and they say, okay, there are only mothers and children. Because everybody else, the young people, the strong people, the non-infirm people, they were all taken away. So within 1 hour, we were supposed to be down in front of the gate and said, just bring a little small thing, like your toothbrush, and what we are going to do is take you to a doctor, for a physical exam. After all, you didn't have one for a long time. It was always in what they did was they were brutal at that point because we lived amongst the general population. The Jews only represented less than 5% because half of them were taken away already. There had 200,000 Jews, and then they took them, not 200,000, but they took away a large portion of them. So they only had mothers and children. So we were taken to a large square, and then we waited till it filled up with other Jews from the surrounding areas. And at one point, an Arrow Cross guy comes out with a bullhorn and says, okay, now the children will go on one side of the square and the mothers stay in place. So I didn't talk much about my mother, but my mother was a non-compliant person. Oh, okay, thanks. Was a non-compliant person. If she was said Jews are allowed only 2 hours, 2 hours a day outside, and she went out during not any one of those 2 hours because she could buy something cheaper or whatever. And so when she heard that guy say with bullhorns, children go there and she stays there in place, my mother grabbed, she held on to me. And she said, you're not going. So I was 7. I didn't know really the nuance of all these things. I just did what my mother said or whatever. And she said, you stay with me. And I'll tell you, all the children that I saw all went, except for me. So hell broke loose because one of the Arrow Cross guys tried, like I said, they weren't brutal because of the general population, and they wanted us to be compliant, not necessarily like my mother. That we should listen to authority. And one soldier comes over and starts to grab my mother, and maybe another soldier came to try to grab me. And they couldn't tear me away from my mother. I mean, she was a strong person. You know, she was a little Jewish woman. and um, they didn't know what to do. So they said, okay, we'll let her march with. Uh, they let me march with her. And we started going outside Budapest toward the brick factory. We had kept going. But we didn't keep going because my mother all of a sudden collapsed. She didn't fake it. She really collapsed, you know. And I almost still kind of in my mind remember that she fell totally erect, you know, like when they pulled Saddam Hussein down from his pedestal. That's how she did. And she fainted and she became, they didn't know what to do with us. So what they did was they took us back to the ghetto. And then they put, there's going to be another day, and next time they'll pick us up and they'll get us anyway. But what happened was that my cousin came to our ghetto location, and after she was taken out herself by Raoul Wallenberg, you know, so she had a document, a Swiss document for us, one of these Schutzpasses. And you know, there was a thing that a Swedish passport was more valuable in terms, not in terms of money, but in terms of survival. It had more, it was rated better. You know, maybe bonds or whatever, AAA, AA, you know, that kind of thing. And I didn't mean to be funny, but sometimes, sometimes I just grab at anything, you know, to make sure that you are with me. That's not true. But are you still? Do you follow what's going on?
Yes.
Okay. You can ask questions anytime or anybody. Okay, so therefore, we didn't have to wait for another day to be taken away on those marches, on those death marches. And we got into one of these 32 houses that Raoul Wallenberg purchased. Okay, and I'll tell you, it was packed with people. We may have been, I don't know, I don't remember the count, 30, 40 people. There was no furniture. That much I do remember. There was no furniture. And we slept head to toe. And I don't know how, again, my mother got that we were sleeping, had sleeping space in the kitchen. Okay? And I remember that there were diapers hung over our head, you know, because there were children there too. And so it was so many people. And, you know, when I think about it, there was one bathroom, no two the bathrooms. So how could 30, 40, 50 people not kill each other? You know, with that kind of difficult existence. I don't remember what that part, you know, I don't remember any arguments, or I don't want to dwell on it. But that's really vague in my mind. But today, I could think of you know, how could all these people get along with each other? And So it was very difficult to live there, and but it was relatively safe, because then after a while they were taking away people too. I don't know based on what criteria. If you had a Swiss Schusspass with a low number, stamp number, then maybe you were safe. Who knows what the criteria was. So, okay, it was in November and December, and by December, Budapest was totally surrounded by Russians. It was all street-to-street fighting, so you didn't know when your street is going to be liberated by the Russians. Liberated means really liberated at that point because you weren't sent to a concentration camp, but living under Russian rule wasn't that hot either. But still it was much safer. Well, for other reasons it wasn't safe, different reasons. Because of anti-Semitism in Hungary, you never felt safe. Somebody could turn you into it just was not a good situation.
When you were, when you were living in one of those 32 buildings, did he?
Yeah,
did he provide food as well, or could you go out and get food?
No, we couldn't go out.
Oh, okay.
I don't know who provided food. I really don't know. I don't know who cooked. And some things I don't want to make up because certain things I do remember like yesterday. Okay? And I just knew that we lived in the ghetto and we had but we couldn't go out from there because everybody was afraid anyway. From the bombs, they kept coming down. Every day the planes kept coming, armada of planes that was... you could have died in your own building, in your safe building, with the Swiss Schutzpass. But those were the times, people you could die anyway. But one thing I remember, and I really remember that distinctly, that if there was danger, you always thought it's the other guy that's going to be in danger. I don't know why, but we never thought of that we'll be taken away or and sometimes, like my mother fainting, that saved our lives. My cousin coming with the Schutzpass saved our lives. And I could talk about so many other things. Now let me tell you, I have a book here. I'll tell you from memory because in 14 years I learned it. A woman who survived and she lived in Israel after the war. Her name was Miriam Herzog. Doesn't matter. You don't have to remember the name. But she talks about that, what it was like during the marches. And she said the elderly people couldn't keep up. And it was cold. It was close to Christmas. And they couldn't keep up, so they were shot. Or if they collapsed, let's say at night, some people froze to the ground. It was all farm country. And it was terrible. So, if my mother had given me up, I would have been separated, and who knows what would have happened to me in the same death march. But the reason I'm talking about this particular incident is to demonstrate what would have happened to me had my mother complied with the rules. But also, what really always, I feel, when there was a farmer, who came out with a bucket of water. And as Miriam Herzog was saying, they were hungry and they were cold and all that, but they were mostly thirsty. And here is this farmer. He probably never saw a Jew in his life. And he comes out with a bucket and a ladle. And the arrow cross says, if you make one more move, one more step, I'll shoot you. And this farmer just says, try me. And that really had an impact on my evaluating what people did just instinctively, you know? The other problem that we all have, we can't help it, you know, we have become immune to violence, to terrible things, you know. We watch the news, and you know, we watch what happens in Syria to their own people, you know. We become immune. You see Dane and Dale, you know, but a farmer like that, he was a moral person, and a lot of okay. So far I told you how he's saved by his Raoul Wallenberg, how he saved 20,000, 15,000, 20,000 people. But then he also saved another 70,000 people by going to the commandant of the ghetto, who was ready to blow up the whole ghetto with people. There were still 70,000 people left in the ghetto at Christmas time. And the city was surrounded, so they couldn't even be made to march away, you know. But the arrow cross just kept killing people, and Raoul Wallenberg went to the commandant and said, what did he say? I'm the representative of the king, and you could save your life if I testify on your behalf. The same story. And he didn't blow up the ghetto. That's how he saved another 70,000 people. But you know, Christmas time was terrible. Christmas period, it's not a Christmas day. That period, terrible. And people couldn't be taken away, so what did the Arrow Cross do? They marched people from the ghetto to the Danube, to the banks of the Danube. And that's what, you know, you saw the memorial of shoes. Did everybody see that? It's a memorial of shoes for the people who were taken to the Danube, to the banks of the Danube, okay? And these shoes are not real shoes. They are made out of bronze or iron or whatever. And this is a memorial to commemorate the Jews that were taken to the bank of the Danube. And you know, people don't know. Many people who go to Budapest, even tourists, they don't know about this, but this memorial exists. Now, what did they do with the Jews? How did they shoot them? Now, they came up with a plan that if they tie 3 Jews together, okay, one on the right, one on the left, and they tie them together, then one bullet could kill 3 people, because if they kill the person in the middle, they'll fall in the Danube, and it would be carried away. They would be carried away by the ice on the river. I always call it the Red Danube. The Danube is good. So so they were trying to kill people till the very end. And then really what happened was uh, you were lucky enough, like I was lucky. I was freed by the Russians on the 15th of January from that Swiss house. And Raoul Wallenberg, on the 17th of January, which is 2 days later, he was approached by a driver, a Russian driver, jeep driver, or whatever car it was. I don't know. He was approached and he said, General Malinowski, who wanted to see you, and he didn't know, the driver didn't know what it was about. Neither did Raoul Wallenberg know what it was all about. So he was picked up and he was taken to the countryside, to a much smaller town than Budapest. And the Russians kidnapped him and they sent him to Siberia. And if anybody wants, I have a book, I'll find it, that was, it documents all the things that happened to Raoul Wallenberg to the best of our knowledge, because really the Russians never admitted that, that they kidnapped him, they had him, and my cousin, sometimes in the 70s, people who came out from Siberia said, oh yeah, I was in another cell in Siberia, next to a Swede. And people thought that there is some chance of finding the truth about Raoul Wallenberg, and maybe the Russians will consent in freeing him. And that's when my cousin, Susan, was a founding member of the Raoul Wallenberg Foundation, committee, and she was speaking about Wallenberg. And that's why I continue speaking for her as a testimonial. And that's why I'm doing it. But, and this book, The Conspiracy About Wallenberg, Harriman, who was the ambassador to Russia, was urged to find out, and the Russians denied it. But the conspiracy, the title, says that every government, the United States, Sweden, or any government, was afraid to shake things up with the Russians. Everybody was afraid of them. That they'll take over part of Europe. Well, they took over part of Europe, the Iron Curtain and all. But why did they take Raoul Wallenberg away? Nobody really knows why that happened. But number one, they couldn't fathom as to why somebody could save so many Jews, because nobody else could, nobody else would. Why is it? Unless he was maybe colluding with the Germans about something, Or he was a Westerner. He went to an American school in Michigan, to the university to study architecture. And there were all kinds of suppositions why they didn't want a Western influence in Hungary. They wanted to really clamp down on Hungarian, because they wanted it to become a communist country, and they had unbelievable hatred, almost like me, against the Hungarians. That's not all Hungarians, because there were thousands of people that saved individual Jews. But Raoul Wallenberg did it in an organized way, that he had a plan on what to do and so on. And it's terrible that he was killed or died actually as a prisoner. Now, many times when I rode the subway in New York, to school and wherever, I used to worry that if you find some person trying to kill a passenger on the train, let's say, or there would be something that maybe I would be asked to, not verbally asked, but I would have to save somebody's life. I had the opportunity, like that farmer, to give water to the Jews. That I would be able to do something instinctively rather than try to rationalize things. And I always was afraid of that. That if I'm asked, well, suppose I got married fairly young, I was still going to school, I could say, well, I didn't even have a college degree, and so on. Okay, so I can't really stand up and try to intervene in a hypothetical case. And then I have a wife, I have to worry about that. And, I could rationalize, but fortunately, nobody ever asked me. So, really, now I'm 75, and chances are that nobody will ever ask me from now on. But it really bothered me to just a hypothetical case, And when I look at the individual Hungarians or what Raoul Wallenberg did, it's mind-boggling. So anybody wants to ask any questions that that you would like to find out about or anything? Yes.
I was just thinking about your mother. I mean, she's a mother, but there were a lot of mothers. So what did your mother have in her, from what you knew, that made her strong enough to do that?
Okay, my mother was a survivor. She really was. She came from Poland to Hungary and then married my father. And, my mother, like I said, to save some money, because we really didn't have much money. So let's say she went for bread out during the time that she wasn't allowed. So what did she do to protect herself? Then she took her pocketbook and she covered the star. By today's standard, you would think that it wasn't a rational thing, but she did, but she was that kind of a person. Even when she came to the United States, she lived on Social Security only, or maybe SSI, Social Security and SSI. And it was, whatever, let's say it was $50 a month altogether. That's what she got. I think it somehow grew into $55, and she didn't go anything illegal. Well, when I came, actually, she came a year before me to the United States. 1954, I came in 55 from France. And she had a 3-bedroom apartment, $55 a month in the Bronx. And she rented out 2 rooms two people who are not related, two bedrooms, and kept one for herself. And I lived in the living room on the couch when I came. So, she always did things like that. And I can, she truly was a survivor. But all of us were survivors. It's, if you ask me, it's, anybody could game the system because they were so smart. And they had they either had to have somebody protect them or some other way or whatever way. I would say that nobody could game the system. It was maybe providence, if you believe in God, miracle, whatever you want to call it. So give it a name. That's what, or anybody, the story that I told you isn't the most, what should I say, dramatic or whatever. People thought, the ghetto was just as bad as being in the concentration camp. There was just a couple of steps away, whether you survived or you died. And nobody can explain that. And I think about it. And that's another thing, when I speak to schools, I don't do it anymore. I speak if I'm asked. I always go only if I'm asked. That much I can tell you. But I ask students, well, are you familiar with the Holocaust? Or have you seen any movies? Oh yeah. Schindler's List. And I say, well, what did you learn from it? Oh, it's a terrific movie. And that's it. That's what they learn from. So I stopped asking them, And Ralph Wallenberg, there were at least 2 television shows with Ralph Wallenberg. None of them were a success, and I can tell you why. They showed what he did, the miracle, of going to groups before being taken away or whatever. But there was so much killing that Gail and I couldn't even watch it. They showed the most awful, not worthwhile remembering, because that's not how it went. It's not how it went. And because of that, somehow, he never made what I would call a terrific movie a la Schindler.
Well, since you mentioned Schindler's List, comment and a question. The actor who played the commandant on Schindler's List, after he made that movie, he actually made a movie about life in Hungary in the late 1800s to the 50s, and he played the same character, played part of the same family member 3 times, a movie called Sunshine.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
It was a great movie, part of it took place during the Holocaust.
Yeah.
It's a really great
It
movie.
was a very great movie.
Right. And later there was another movie called Sunshine later on, which is completely different. This movie called Sunshine during life in Austria. But the question is, have you seen the news footage? What's going on in Hungary now? There's currently an anti-Semitic government in Hungary. In 2012.
Yeah, that's true. It's anti-democratic.
And right-wing,
Right-wing,
anti-democratic.
You're
How does this
absolutely
go on
right.
with aren't they part of the European Union?
They are part of the Union.
And they're allowing this?
I don't know. It's a very good question. It's an excellent question. As a matter of fact, the fellow who I said died by being at the Vatican embassy, his wife just send me on the internet arrow cross, not an arrow cross guy because it doesn't exist, but with that same mentality and the same uniform, and it says 7 years later it still exists. Now, I'll tell you a story that you may not. I'll tell it to you. Anybody has to leave or anything? It's going to be a short story. When my first son was born, and in those days, my wife was in the hospital for 4 days. Can you imagine 4 days in the hospital for a baby? It's very unusual. But no, she didn't have any complications. That was normal. Okay, so it was on a Friday. On Sunday, my soccer team that I used to root for, it was called MTK, came to New York to play in some kind of a competition with other teams from all over the world. It's like the women's hockey. You know, nobody knew about the soccer that they played. But anyway, I said to my wife, hey, would you mind very much if I went to the soccer game instead of coming to see you? I'll come in at 12 o'clock before the visiting hours, and then I'll come back. You know, they play an hour and a half. So she was pretty agreeable to it. And I had to see that team. My father used to root for that team, and generations of Jews used to, you know, it had something to do with, it had some connections to a Jewish club. Back in the early, the 1800s. It gave Jews an opportunity to belong to a club. So, I don't know, I had to see it because I wasn't that mature at that time. You know, it was very important that I went to see it. And there was no rationale for it while I did that. And I went, I don't even remember the score or anything, so it doesn't matter. But later on, when the Hungarians became free and democratic, they threw off the yoke of the communist system. Okay? And there was an article about it in the New York Times about my team. And the team that I'm rooted for. And they have nothing to do with the founders of a Jewish group, you know, because it was in the 1800s. When MTK scored a goal, the fans of the opposite teams in unison screamed, "Jews, Jews to the gas chamber."
Where was this game?
In Budapest. No, that wasn't here. I just wanted to tell you that it was so important for me to go on. My first son was born.
What year was this?
It was, well, when they became free democratic.
Yeah.
Quotes. I'm putting it into. It had to be after 1990.
Wow.
It was 1990. You know, there is a lot of anti-Semitism in Hungary. I would never talk to a group, well, this is a Jewish group, but you know, I had spoken to any group. And I am not ashamed, not afraid of expressing my Jewishness. But you know, I lived in Strasbourg, France. I went to a Jewish school called Ort. And it was best not to be public about your Jewishness. Still today. You know, Well, they just when did they kill that child and the rabbis just a few weeks ago. You know, that's in France, here in Toulouse. You know, so this will be the. I'll take more questions, but I have to tell you that story. We met in a principal of a school who retired from France. He's a French citizen and a Jewish guy. And we went to a lecture there and I. We went to a lecture about Rashi. You know, there was something Jewish, so we went. And I talked to him in French, and he told me he was in Prague. And at the railroad station, people were offering part of a room in their house, you know. So this guy said, "Oh, he gets off the train coming from France, and the guy approaches him, hey, do you want a room in my apartment?" Okay. And he takes a room, and next day the owner of that apartment says, hey, how about I'll give you a tour of Prague. So I said, okay, I'll take a tour. So he takes a tour, and what does the owner of the apartment do? He takes him to all the Christian churches and Christian this, Christian that, and that's what he sees from Prague. So he thought, well, I'm going to teach that guy a lesson. So for breakfast, he put on a kippah. And so the owner comes into the kitchen and he's dumbfounded. Why? Because he said, are you Jewish? He asked, I didn't know you're Jewish, meaning the French guy. He said, yeah, I'm Jewish. He said, so am I. He said, but why the hell did you take me to all those Christian sites? He went to see Jewish sites. But one was afraid to tell the other that he's Jewish. And what did the owner say? I was afraid. And that just stayed with us, you know, not just as a story, but as a fact of life, you know, that you only feel safe, not everywhere, even here.
What's amazing is the skinhead in Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, Russia, who lost
77 million people.
Pro-Nazi, talk about hypocrisy. Doesn't make sense.
A lot of people don't make sense. Okay. Any more questions? Or
How about a round of applause for our guest Gabe?
Having such a good crowd supporting me and being interested. And thank you, Susan, for thinking of me. But thanks everybody for coming.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much.
You guys just sit still for like 2 more minutes. I just want to let you guys know about some upcoming events going on for the Holocaust Remembered.